talk today about research ethics and policy and tell a few stories. I have been in science and science policy for a very long time, since dinosaurs roamed the earth. And I've had the opportunity to be an observer, a participant, and an occasional leader in important science programs and science policy development. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I have worked for the government and did actually 2 tours of duty at the National Institutes of Health, one at the Genome Institute and one in the Office of the Director. And I no longer work there. And while I did work there, I had to be quite careful about what I said because I was representing the government. Today, I'm going to be quite candid in what I say. So I'm going to be sort of unplugged and uncensored, and I hope a little bit provocative. So the things that I would like to talk about today fall into 3 buckets: clinical research, patient centricity, and data sharing. And I will talk about each of these in turn. So in my view, the current clinical research system is significantly broken. And some of the problems with that system are listed here, and I'm going to talk about many of these, though not all. So for example, I will not talk about the problem in taking the results from the important work that you all do and getting that implemented and taken up by the healthcare delivery system. It's a thorny problem, but not one that I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to start by talking about inclusion in clinical research, and we have a pretty serious problem here with inclusion in clinical research. We need to be including women along with men. We need to be including racial and ethnic minorities. We need to be including older people, and importantly, we need to be including people who have multiple chronic conditions. And that's not the case presently, although with some new clinical trial designs and with the sort of the growth in utilization of real-world evidence, that may be modifying somewhat. So I want to talk a little bit about why we don't have the right people in clinical research. So more broadly than just recruiting women and racial and ethnic minorities and rural populations and sick people into clinical trials, we actually don't have very good evidence about how to recruit and retain people in clinical research. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. Our enrollment criteria are often too stringent so that by the time we get that small, narrow set of people who meet those criteria, they don't really represent the vast majority of people who actually suffer from a particular condition. Many of you who have submitted grants for NIH research have submitted a table with your proposed enrollment in your human study or clinical trial. And I certainly did that when I was at Johns Hopkins on the faculty there and doing human subjects research. And those tables are sort of a pain to put together. And I just imagined that there was great stewardship going on at NIH and that those were being monitored in some way and that people were sort of collecting that data and using it in aggregate form to learn something. So when I went back to NIH for my second tour of duty, I was stunned to find out that, in fact, nobody looked at those tables. So they were submitted in a PDF form. They were never extracted out of that PDF form. It was never aggregated across institutes and centers. And so basically, it was only for the person who was managing that specific grant to know and monitor. So that's not good. The other thing that is a serious issue is that inclusion by itself is not sufficient. We need to be doing analysis of the outcomes by the individual demographic groups in order to learn from that. So a little bit of history here, and this is a long history, right? This is a 30-plus year history where we've been trying, and I would say failing, to solve this problem. So in 1986, NIH adopted a policy that said we should have women and men in clinical research. In 1993, that good idea became the law, and it was included in the NIH Revitalization Act, which was a reauthorization act for NIH. And women were sort of the tip of the spear here, and racial and ethnic minorities came soon after and were included in the NIH Revitalization Act, and it requires inclusion. When I came back to NIH in 2009, and we were looking at these data and scratching our heads, when Obama got elected president, he tapped on Francis Collins' shoulder and said, come be my NIH director, and Francis Collins tapped on my shoulder and said, come be my number 2, and I said, no frickin' way, but he was pretty persuasive, so I ended up there with him about a week after he started. So we started to look at these data and really taking this on as a very serious matter. The other thing that came across my desk is I was responsible for all the interactions with Congress, among other things. And so all of the reports that would go to Congress came across my desk, and I actually read them. And one of them was about minority inclusion in clinical research. And it talked at great length about all of these interesting and innovative methods that were being used in order to be able to recruit racial and ethnic minorities into clinical research, and how great they were, and they were being funded, and so on and so forth. And then it had a graph of percentage of racial and ethnic minorities over time, and it was a completely flat line. Completely flat line. There was no mention in this report that these programs that were, they were talking about with such pride actually were not accomplishing what they were set out to do. During my time at NIH, the Government Accountability Office did an investigation at Congress's request to really look at what were we doing right and what were we doing wrong. And as a consequence of that, there was a new policy about inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research, and it's probably too early to be able to measure whether or not that has had a significant and important impact or not. I certainly hope NIH monitors it. Just last month, NIH put out guidelines for reviewers. So if you're going to require that investigators say how they're going to be inclusive, or if they're not, why not, and how they're going to analyze their data, then reviewers of those applications need to know what to look for. And so guidelines for the reviewers just came out last month. So there certainly is room for improvement. This is data from a paper by a woman named Stacy Geller and her colleagues, in which she looked at reporting on outcomes by sex and race and ethnicity and NIH-funded published clinical trials in top journals. And she has done this on 3 occasions of studies published in 2004, 2009, and 2015. And what you can see is that we have not gotten, nothing's really changed, right? So the majority of studies either don't analyze by sex or don't explain why they didn't. And of course, there are certainly some cases in which that would be a reasonable thing to do. And similarly for race and ethnicity, an even higher percentage do not report on outcomes based on race and ethnicity, nor do they explain why not. So there's certainly a lot of room for improvement here. Hopefully NIH and the research community and the entire ecosystem will be very attentive to this over time. I don't know who the groups really are that are paying laser-like attention to these issues, but I certainly hope that there are some and that they will pay attention as these new guidelines go into effect. I told you about this report that came across my desk on the way to the Hill about inclusion of racial and ethnic minorities in clinical research, and I looked really hard to find that report in order to include that graph that is sort of emblazoned in my brain in this talk, and I could not find it. And in fact, finding data about inclusion in clinical research is hard to find. I spent a bunch of time on the NIH website digging around trying to find it, and I ultimately found this. And so if everybody will turn their head 90 degrees sideways and bring out your magnifying glass, you might be able to read this table that was in an appendix of a report on page 380 about inclusion of women in clinical research. So I want to move now to another area of clinical research where there actually is some more encouraging news, I think. So clinical research takes too long. From the time that you get your funding in hand to the time that you get IRB approval, to the time that you get FDA clearance if you need it, to the time that you actually enroll your first participant, it's a really, really long time. And we need to save time in order to save lives, and so we need to be able to constrict this process. One of the things that when I was at NIH, my team worked on really hard was a group of clinical trial stewardship reforms, and one of them was working on modifying the common rule for humans in biomedical research, which was started at the very beginning of the Obama administration and hit some bureaucracy along the way. And when it hit that bureaucracy along the way, we sort of looked at ourselves and said, what can we do at NIH, assuming that this regulation never gets finalized, which it did, but assuming it never gets finalized, what can we do at NIH to really make the flow of research more fluid and less administratively burdensome? And so one of the things that we took a very close look at was institutional review board review. So how many people here have served on an institutional review board? Surprisingly few, actually. So human subjects research has to be reviewed by an institutional review board. And back when the common rule for ethical conduct of research was put in place, there was a belief by the sort of the authors that the ethical review needed to take into consideration the values that were important to individual communities where the research would be done. And as a consequence, it's a local institutional review board. That means if you do multi-site research, you have to have an IRB at all of those institutions taking a look at your research. And of course, the notion that academic researchers, who are mostly the people who are on IRBs, would actually be from and reflect the values of that community is a little bit old-fashioned concept. So having many different IRBs from every different city reviewing a protocol is one of the biggest causes of frustration for researchers, and it is one of the biggest causes of time being consumed on the way to putting a protocol into action. And so one of the things that we did was we put forward a rule, which has now been implemented, that if you do multi-site clinical research, you have to use a single IRB unless you have a very good reason why not. And in some cases, there are good reasons why not. So you might want to have a local IRB review if you were doing research, for example, on a reservation as one of your sites. So the next issue I want to talk about with respect to clinical research and clinical trials is that too many studies fail without producing data. And that is a very sad thing indeed. So, oops, I didn't know that I wanted that there. I'll skip to here. So about 5% of clinical trials fail without producing any data. And the biggest single cause of that is not hitting recruitment targets. So between 35 and 40, and it varies by therapeutic area, with oncology being the worst. There's very little data, as I said, on recruitment and retention methods. The evidence that exists about whether a method for trying to invite people to participate and successfully in a research study is from small, underpowered studies, usually with specific populations in a specific therapeutic area. So we need to do much better. And I think actually we have enough large research enterprises now that we could embed research on recruitment and retention in a cluster randomized way in multi-site studies on all sorts of therapeutic conditions and with all sorts of populations. So this is an area that is in dire need of attention. So patient engagement and patient partnership and patient centricity has really become the buzzword of the day, certainly in Washington. And part of that is really been driven by policy. So this shows a little bit of a timeline with some of the key things that have taken place over time that have really led to an increased focus on having patients at the center of the research enterprise. And of course, in the late 80s and early 90s, it was the HIV community that demanded funding for research on HIV and AIDS. It was the HIV activists who demanded that FDA move more quickly to clear products for use. It was this community that really galvanized attention on Capitol Hill and across the country to get attention on this important disease. And in fact, now it is a chronic condition. One of my closest friends was one of the first people in HIV clinical study, AZT clinical trial. He now has undetectable virus, and he really credits participation in clinical research as having saved his life. More recently, there have been patient focus in the 21st Century Cures Act, which really advances the notion that we should be able to collect real-world evidence from free-roaming, free-ranging humans and be able to use that to do label expansion, for example, for medications, to be able to really use data that's coming from sources other than the gold standard of a randomized clinical trial. There has been requirements for FDA to think about and implement measures that will put patient-reported outcomes as key for sponsors and bringing new medical products forward. So if you are measuring things on a particular disease or condition, are those things that you are measuring the things that matter most to the people who have those conditions? And being able to validate what are those patient-reported outcomes that matter and being able to integrate them into the regulatory system. The one other thing on this timeline that I want to mention just really quickly is the All of Us research program. So while I was at NIH, I got to be on the architectural team that designed this program, which is has a goal of recruiting 1 million people into a longitudinal cohort that will be followed forever. And one of the basic values that we sort of cooked into that program is that the participants be partners and that they participate in all aspects of the study, from the design of the study to the governance of the study, and receiving their results back. And I'll come back to this issue of getting your own data back in a minute. It ended up being hugely controversial and ended up in, I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But so all of these things are happening that really are putting the patients at the center, and yet we don't really have good idea about how to partner effectively with patients in the design, conduct, and reporting of the research that we do. So speaking of patient-reported outcomes, too often we are doing studies that are answering questions that we think are pretty interesting, but may not matter the most to the people who suffer from those conditions. In the Affordable Care Act, there was included the creation of an organization called the People-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which really was intended to try to refocus research attention on the outcomes that matter most to people, to understand what are those outcomes and how to target research in that arena. We've seen a lot of survival curves over the course of this meeting, and survival matters a lot to a lot of people, but it's not the only thing that matters. And certainly in some situations, it matters much less than other outcomes that are important to people depending on who they are, where they are, and what they suffer with. So we have, in partnering with people, we have ourselves, the scientific community, we have our research participants, And we're really in the midst of a cultural shift. Paternalism has been sort of the way medicine and research in particular operated for decades. It wasn't that long ago that patients were not told when they had a cancer diagnosis. Now, the whole issue of providing, and it wasn't that long ago that it was difficult, if not impossible, for individuals to get their own medical records. As a result of pretty recent policy late in the Obama administration, it is now a requirement that individuals be able to easily get their medical records, right? So it used to be you could get them, but you had to have a fax machine in order to receive them. Now it's a requirement that you be able to get them easily. So that's a big step forward. What we haven't quite wrestled to the ground is the issue of providing research results to people who participate in studies. So certainly in many studies, people are promised the aggregate results of those studies, but not their own individual results. And so that's been quite an issue of discussion and is important to many research participants. The Institute of Medicine recently did a study in which they basically conclude that it should be our goal as a research community to be able to figure out how to responsibly return research results to people who participate in studies. Certainly in genetics, that has been on people's minds for a long time, and what do you do about variants of unknown significance, so on and so forth. But I think we really are hitting a moment now where we will be needing to provide that information back to research participants. So we are at a nice inflection point in being able to partner with patients in the research that we do, and also now with new technologies, being able to do virtual or decentralized or digital or mobile trials. I think we need to settle on a name here. Those are all names that are pretty widely used, that we'll be able to move the conduct of research out of the clinic and into the communities. And as we do that, there's an increased opportunity to really have patients at the forefront. Certainly the movers and shakers in this arena have been the patients themselves, and there are a number of incredibly vocal and powerful and influential leaders. Sharon Terry is the author of this article, and she's been just a force of nature in moving people's hearts and minds to make some of this stuff happen. And there's some really good examples of successes here too. So certainly in cystic fibrosis research, where the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was leading the charge, and patients and those who love them really leading the research and to great positive impact. The PCORI, which I mentioned a minute ago, the People-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, funded the creation of a nationwide clinical research network, which I used to run until about 6 weeks ago when I quit. And we, as a nationwide research organization, adopted a patient partnership framework, which is described here, and really has an opportunity, I think, to move forward this notion of having true partnership with patients. So there is some good news amidst all of these problems in the clinical research arena. We have now a single IRB required. There are new human subject rules out there now that provide some real innovations both for researchers to speed their work, but also to increase the participation of research participants. NIH has recently put in place a new policy for clinical trials, which should go a long way towards ending a criticism that some have waged about the research that NIH funded. And I'll share a little story here. So Janet Woodcock, who's the head of the Center of Drugs at FDA, and Rob Califf, who used to be the FDA commissioner, used to say frequently and publicly that NIH funded RCTs, randomized clinical trials, but mostly what we funded were SCTs, small, crappy trials. And it really bugged me. And it was a motivation in many ways for a lot of the clinical trial stewardship work that we ended up doing. And part of the reason is that applications would be submitted by well-meaning and brilliant investigators who were doing research in an animal model, for example, and then they would add on a third or a fourth aim about maybe moving that into humans. What that meant was, oftentimes, that investigative team didn't have much experience in doing clinical research, and that the reviewers didn't have experience in clinical research, and that the person who's managing that grant doesn't have experience in clinical research. And those clinical studies were the ones who ended up taking too long and often failing. And so the whole way in which clinical trials are now solicited, reviewed, and monitored has been changed as a result of that. So I want to turn now to data sharing. And I want to start with a premise that having the methods, policies, and practices of open science adopted can speed research, knowledge acquisition, and the development and implementation of things that can improve health. I don't know that we have the evidence yet to prove that that's true. It would be nice to collect the evidence to show that that's true, but I'm going to use that as my sort of working hypothesis here. So data sharing in biomedical research has largely been tethered to publication, and yet we now have the tools and technologies to be able to share data in many, many, many other ways that are cheaper, faster, and better. I want to sort of tell a couple of stories here about data sharing that may be illuminating or at least interesting. So the really early models for data sharing in biomedicine that untied to a publication were really born out of the Human Genome Project. And in my first tour of duty at NIH, I worked at the Human Genome Project as the assistant director for something, policy and planning or something. And I started there before the genome of E. coli had been yet sequenced, and I ended after the publication of the draft genome sequence. So data sharing for the massive collaboration that was involved in sequencing the human genome was really sort of a necessity, and there was competition going on at the time. And so early on in, I think it was 1996, the genome community adopted the Bermuda rules, which said that sequence had to be released when you had an assembly of a KB or more, and it had to be released within 24 hours. So that was pretty profound, and really is the culture, I think, in genomics broadly. We heard some interesting references yesterday to the Cancer Genome Atlas. There are many other examples of rapid, effective data sharing in genomics. So genomics also provides this interesting example of when data sharing and privacy end up really coming to the fore, right? So one of the reasons why dbGaP is a protected data resource is because of concern that people could be identified with those data. So I want to share a little story with you here of the genome of HeLa cells. So I'm sure most, if not all of you, know the story of Henrietta Lacks, who had a very aggressive form of cervical cancer and died at the young age of 31 at Johns Hopkins, and cells from her were biopsied and later were the very first cell line that was developed there. So her cells are everywhere. In fact, they are a very frequent source of contamination. So this is sort of a little bit of HeLa history. So George Guy, who was a researcher at Johns Hopkins, he was the first person to be able to get HeLa cells to grow indefinitely in culture. After he died, there was a obituary that was written about him in the journal Obstetrics and Gynecology. And weirdly, it identified Henrietta Lacks as the source of those cells, which was completely inappropriate, even at the time. It included a photograph of Henrietta in the obituary. And there's a little excerpt of the obituary here on the upper right side. And I was rereading it and putting together this talk, and I was struck by the first sentence. It has been often said that scientific discovery results when the right man is in the right place at the right time. So then in 1970, and look at who the authors are of this obituary. So Howard Jones, anybody know what he did? Anybody? First IVF baby was the work of Howard Jones. Victor McCusick, you all have to know who Victor McCusick is, the father of human genetics. Pretty interesting. So in 1976, Victor published a paper about the genetic characteristics of HeLa cells, and of course this is way before modern genetic methods were available. There was a documentary in 1997, and then in 2010, Rebecca Skloot wrote this book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. In 2013, a German team of geneticists published the full sequence of one particular line of HeLa cells. That set off a bioethical storm, and it was very concerning for us at NIH because we were and they are the sort of stewards of policy around the conduct of biomedical research. So this was very important to us. So I called Rebecca, who I knew, and I asked her if she would please introduce Francis and I to the family, that we needed to figure out a path forward. And at the same time, I reached out to all the institutes to find out if anyone had any funding that was going into sequencing HeLa cells. So was another shoe going to drop, and we should be ready for that? And it turns out there was. There was a paper that had been submitted and accepted by Jay Shenduri, who's at the University of Washington here, and an amazingly wonderful and talented guy, and it was ready to be published in Nature. And so Jay, being Jay, was very helpful in agreeing to delay the publication of his paper until we could work through this issue, and Nature obviously also going along with that. So what then ensued was a series of meetings with the Lacks family in which we talked about how can we move towards a resolution that will advance science. So first, could we get to an agreement that advancing science was a good idea? What did they see as a positive success story? And what would we need to do together to get to that endpoint? And it was an amazing, so we had a series of meetings with the family. It was truly the most important professional experience of my life so far. So we would have a meal together and talk, and it was very clear that the family wanted these cells to contribute to research. And we had this wonderful opportunity of being able to tell the family about what we learned from the sequence of the HeLa genome, how HeLa cells have been used in research, various ways that we can protect and direct the research that's being conducted. And I remember Francis jumping up and drawing on a whiteboard. We were in a conference room together, and drawing on a whiteboard, and it occurred to me that we knew, and the family probably did not know, one of the most interesting things in the HeLa genome, which was that there was an insertion of human papillomavirus just upstream of the MYC proto-oncogene. So probably the cause of her cervical cancer, right? So we worked with the family, and they really wanted this research to get done, but they wanted to be at the table and be involved. And so we ended up coming to an agreement and put in place a policy to govern this. And that was announced in an article that we wrote together, Francis and I wrote together, and it was published at the same time that Jay's genome sequence was published in Nature magazine. So the policy basically was that you had to apply to get access to the genome sequence, and you had to abide by the terms that the family had specified, which are listed here, which including an acknowledgement to Henrietta and the family in the publications and presentations, and that all requests would be reviewed by a working group that included members of the family. And so up there with Francis in this picture are 3 members of the Lacks family, Jerry, David, and Shirley Lacks, 2 grandkids, and a daughter-in-law of Henrietta. So that was a nice opportunity to think about how do you include people other than researchers in the policy that you're creating and in the research that you do, and how do you protect privacy while also trying to speed the course of research. So I want to pivot from this genomics example to clinical trials results. I'm going to skip a couple slides here. So why do we want to share clinical trials data? And a number of reasons are listed here. This timer here was supposed to start, and it's saying 60 minutes, so I have no idea how long I've been talking. How long have I been talking? I'll just keep on talking. Okay, thank you. Now time is going really, really fast on my clock. Okay, so why do we want to share clinical trials data? There's a bunch of reasons here. We want to share it because it enhances people's awareness. It should enhance people's interest in participating. It informs the work of IRBs and policymakers and funders. So you don't want to fund a clinical trial that somebody else has already done and you just don't know about it. Lots of reasons. One big reason is that when you ask somebody to participate in clinical research, often you say, you may not benefit from your participation in this research, but other people will, because this knowledge will join the big ecosystem of information out there in the world. And if the data is never released into the world, then we have been lying to people. So this is a now very old paper from Harlan Krumholtz, who is sort of a evangelist about this issue, showing failure of publication. So I talked earlier about data sharing in biomedical research mostly being tethered to publications, but we're not very good at publishing. So 68% of NIH clinical trials, NIH-funded clinical trials, were published within 100 months. That's 8+ years. So what happened to the other 32%? That means 32% of NIH-funded studies were not funded 8 years after they were completed. That is stunning and unacceptable. So I got an opportunity to play in this space, and it's really important to me, sort of personally and professionally. So the history here is that in 1997, Congress had a law that requires a registry at NIH for drugs with serious and life-threatening diseases and conditions. And the National Library of Medicine at NIH created this clinicaltrials.gov registry that was launched in 2000, and it kind of sat there. And in 2007, Congress enacted a law that expanded clinicaltrials.gov to include all clinical trials of FDA-regulated products except phase 1. So phase 2 and beyond, FDA-regulated products must register, I'm doing a clinical trial, and then report their results. So I waltz onto the scene in 2009 and learn about this stuff, and it turns out that it was deeply controversial how exactly to define the requirements for what you included within clinicaltrials.gov. You would think it would be straightforward, it wasn't. And the bureaucracy was kind of at its worst. So years had gone by, and we still didn't have the regulations telling people what exactly they had to submit, nor the database to be able to receive it. So I had an opportunity to work in that area. There were also complaints in the research community that it was hard to enter information into clinicaltrials.gov. So I decided that we would try to figure that out, because if you're going to make somebody do something, you're going to make a researcher do something, you need to make it as easy as possible. So I started trying to enter a fabricated clinical trial into clinicaltrials.gov, and every time I typed something, I would get an error message. Like every time I typed something, I got an error message. And so the people who ran clinicaltrials.gov weren't all that eager to modify their system. So I invited Francis Collins and all of the deputy directors of NIH, the head of the intramural program, the head of the extramural program, everybody, to sit around with computer terminals, and we would all try to enter a clinical trial into clinicaltrials.gov. And the looks on people's faces were just priceless, because these are all like A+ students, and they couldn't figure out how to do it. So that led us to be able to give clinicaltrials.gov the directive to make it more user-friendly. It's still not quite there, but it's a lot better. So we finally managed to put out a proposed rule and then a final rule for clinicaltrials.gov. And we expanded what the law did and said it's fine for people who are doing research that's funded by somebody else to only have to submit information about phase 2 and beyond for medical products, trials with medical products regulated by FDA. But we're the NIH, and if we're funding a clinical study, it should be for all clinical studies that we fund. And so we adopted a policy that requires that all NIH-funded clinical trials be submitted. There's been some controversy since I left where NIH made some decisions about defining clinical research that I don't quite agree with, and some of you may have been aware of that, but I'm not going to talk about that today. So what that means now is that there is this massive collection of information on clinical trials that's available, which should mean that patients and their families should be able to find clinical trials that they may be interested in participating in. It means that funders can look and see whether or not a trial has already been conducted or funded, and so that they don't repeat it, and so there's not that duplication, unintended duplication. Sometimes duplication is intended. And it also means now that there is this huge data set that we can look at and mine to figure out what can we learn about clinical trials and clinical trial design that we might not be obvious from looking at 1 or 2 or 7 or 100 studies, but might be apparent looking at thousands. So that is now in place, and the one, I guess if I were gonna be my Debbie Downer self today and say one bad thing about clinicaltrials.gov, it is that in the law, it said, the secretary may require that there be lay summaries of the clinical trials if she, the secretary, can demonstrate that they can be generated in a non-biased way. And we couldn't find evidence for that, and so we ended up not requiring lay summaries, and I think that's unfortunate. So if you're a patient or a patient group, it would be much easier if you had something that wasn't a full protocol to be able to think about. So these are the key elements of that final rule. So all the protocols have to be posted, adverse event information has to be posted, the anticipated outcomes and that are going to be measured, and then the summary results. So the one last thing I'll touch on in terms of sort of open science and data sharing that is linked to publication is, so we have clinical trials that are out there. Maybe we need a non-clinicaltrials.gov for data that is not clinical trials to be able to get out there into the world. I think certainly preprint archives, bioarchives, and others have made that easier and faster, but maybe we need to follow the clinical trials model in preclinical trials research. But I want to share something that's really bugging me now because I'm unemployed and I still like to read the literature. And so I live my life in this sort of, ivory tower environment in which I had access to everything. And when my brother-in-law got diagnosed with prostate cancer, my sister, who's an information seeker, wanted all of the publications that suggested whether or not robotic surgery or not, this or that, how should she proceed and advise her husband. And so I sent her a whole ton of links to PubMed, and then we would have conversations every night to talk about them. And we're talking about one paper, and she says, well, that really seems to indicate that we should go this way. And I'm like, no, I don't think so. Because in the discussion, blah, 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 blah. And she said, I can only see the abstract. So she was hitting paywalls, and I was oblivious to paywalls. And now I'm not so oblivious to paywalls. So I really wanted to read this article by the director of the FDA now, and the guy who runs clinical trials at NCI, both good humans. I couldn't get it. So that seems like a policy problem that we could solve. So I have done sort of a range of topics here with you today about clinical research, about patient centricity, and about data sharing. And I hope that you have comments and questions that you can share with all of us. But before I wrap up, I want to provide sort of a bookend to the opening keynote address. So you will remember in the opening keynote address, there was a reference to going to the Nobel ceremonies, and I almost included a picture of me at the Nobel ceremonies because I too got to go with a friend who received a Nobel Prize a few years ago, and that was pretty fun stuff. But I wanted to share with you this photograph and ask if anybody can name any of the people in this photograph. Anyone? Well, I will tell you that this guy is my husband, Joe Pelka. He's a reporter for National Public Radio. When you hear him on the news, you can say, oh, I heard a talk from the woman he sleeps with. This guy is Jim Allison. Isn't that funny? And with that, I will thank you for your attention and look forward to conversation.
Thank you very much. So I have a question. Well, if people want to move to the microphones, go for it. But I have a question first. So this issue that you referred to, actually I have two questions. The first issue you referred to about journals. That is an absolute pet peeve of mine as well, because you can publish a paper and then you don't have access to it the next day. And I think the UC system has just gotten into a legal battle with Elsevier over exactly this issue. So I wonder how do you think this is all going to pan out? I mean, I think as a taxpayer, you're paying for research. You should get access to that science that comes out of that. That seems pretty clear.
Yeah, there is a requirement that if your research is funded by the NIH, that it has to be made available in a public server, right? But it's a different time frame and in a different format, and it doesn't make sense. So whose interests are we really trying to protect here? We should be trying to make information as accessible as possible in this day of open science. And there are folks who have been advocating for those kinds of requirements in Capitol Hill. And we at NIH started to take up these issues to see if we could really expand open access rather than sort of the current status quo, and ended up getting knocked down by the publishers. So they are a pretty potent, force. I think the scientific community, if we banded a little bit more tightly together, we could overcome this. But we're not in the business as funders and as researchers. We're not in the business of making the mostly for-profit publishers money. That's not why you got in it. It's not why I got in it. So it's an important problem.
No, but we do need the stamp of approval of a journal, with peer review, and that is not free.
That's true.
So anyway, and the other question I had, and this is a subtle point on clinical trials, but a couple years ago, I pulled together people at a conference, and we were talking about trials in a particular cancer. And it was a cancer, very, very challenging cancer. And it must have been 20 trials. And all of them, they were like 10, 20, 25 patient trials. And all of them had like 1 or 2 people that responded, but basically the trial failed. But there was no data, no phenotypic characterization of the patients. You do the trial, you fail, and then it's Groundhog Day, which I think is a tremendous disservice to the patients. And so I think it's a subtle issue compared to some of the other things you're talking about, but is there a way to have a standard level of patient characterization so that after you do a trial, you actually are guaranteed to have learned something other than responders, non-responders? Is that something you can mandate?
Well, so that's really a question of quality clinical trial design. Right? And I think that I think part of the problem with bad trial design has been inexperienced researchers and inadequate review. So it's that aim for problem, So now it is required that people who review, manage, and fund clinical trials at NIH actually be experts in clinical trials. And I think that's going to make this situation better, where people are going to be saying, if you collected these other pieces of information about phenotypes or other characteristics of these participants, that will be of value irrespective of the outcome of the trial, right?
Yeah, maybe it's a part of patient education as well.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot here about envisioning trials where it's known that people with a particular genotype are more likely to respond. And so a way to make the trials cheaper and potentially more effective and discover who a drug is really going to work for, that idea almost kind of works against the kind of inclusivity that you were really talking about. So my question is, how's this going to play out, and are those trials going to get accused of some kind of discrimination, or what is NIH likely to do about that? I'm curious because I see that personalized trend happening, and it could be really helpful.
Right. So I think when there's a scientific basis we want to do a trial for people with a specific disorder and a specific genotype. If there's a scientific basis, then there's a scientific basis. But if you don't know that, then you want to make sure that you're collecting data as broadly and that will be as applicable to as many people as possible, because ultimately we want the research to benefit everybody who it might benefit. So that's okay. And the rules the rules explicitly allow for that. Yep.
Yeah, I appreciate you closing with the publication, and just to go on that theme, it's almost a perversion because in academics, promotion and stuff is controlled by the publication industry. And when you think of the one-word journals and impact factors, these are often things that are fairly close, so people are compelled to do that. But, you know, a theme that we've had through this meeting has been equality, health equality. We didn't talk about environmental equality, but this is education equality, because the system as it exists today cuts off information to the vast swath of society that from its access, namely schools that aren't universities.
And also folks around the globe, right, who are less
That's right.
have less financial institutions behind them.
Yeah. But I think the solution actually is getting to the tenure committees. That, you know, it's just as good to publish in PLOS as it is Nature, and kind of changing that paradigm. You showed a few times Nature, you know, in some of their heroic effort, Human Genome Project, and your experience with Jay, but Nature and Elsevier is, you know, they are a major force in keeping literature closed.
Yeah, your point about the academic culture and sort of what the reward system, how the reward system is structured, being able to have tenure committees and hiring search committees looking at and valuing contributions to team science and contributions to the generation of big data sets and the publication in journals that are accessible to everybody. I think those are all really important cultural evolutions that need to take place in the academic world now. Thanks.
Dr. Hudson, thank you very much.
Thank you.